to start off. I'm glad to hear that. That's what I wanted to know. I'm honored to be starting this conference, a series of days of discussions, and thank you very much for inviting me along. As Andrew was saying, I'm very interested in the question of understanding, which is not at all the same as explanation. And it's not just the same as being clever. It is feeling oneself into the reality of another thing outside of oneself. And what I try to do in this book, which is called The Matter with Things, or coming out in November, is to ask the question, Plotinus's question, who are we? And what is the world? And what are we to make of the cosmos and our place in it? I'll just mention that now, and I may touch on it a little bit later. So let me just see. Can we get rid of that? This meeting is being recorded. I don't know. Yeah, good. Right. In the 9th century Chinese classic, The Secret of the Golden Flower, it's written that the conscious mind is like a violent general of a strong fiefdom, controlling things from a distance until the sword is turned around. And the sinologist Thomas Cleary comments, Zen Buddhism traditionally describes the mechanism of delusion as mistaking the servant for the master. In the metaphor of this passage, the general is supposed to be a servant, but instead usurps authority. Well, those of you who know my book, The Master and His Emissary, will see how very relevant that 9th century insight into how our minds work, because that is the description of what the writer calls the conscious mind, is vividly portrayed. And what I've found in the last decade since writing The Master and His Emissary is that there are many such myths and fables in many languages, in the Iroquois, in the Inuit, in people in the South Sea Islands, in various lands across the world, that have this image of a force that becomes above itself and usurps a proper authority, and the results are that things fall apart. One reason for worrying about this is that I see the world at the moment in the West as being dominated by a certain way of thinking and looking at the world that was entailed on us by evolution in order to make us good at grabbing and getting. It is effectively not good at understanding. It's very good at helping us get stuff, manipulating the world. The right hemisphere of the brain is good at understanding the world, and the left hemisphere more or less leaves understanding to the right hemisphere. This is partly because we've developed language in the human brain, and language is a map of the world and a way of utilizing it, of finding your way around it and annexing territories in it. So the business of having a left hemisphere has, I can demonstrate, driven out a lot of the things that we need for understanding the world and replaced them with powerful abstractions, maps and schemas. So the left hemisphere's view has evolved to map the world, and it prefers, therefore, what is certain, fixed, abstracted, familiar, decontextualized, two-dimensional, general in nature, categorized, quantifiable, and represented as the world is on a map. That is to say, no longer present, but in some icon-like version of itself after the event, represented. This view of the world sees parts, not wholes. An inanimate world, in fact, a bureaucrat's dream, and it's given to an unwarranted optimism. The other hemisphere, the right hemisphere, sees the world that is being mapped, where things are often new, essentially unique, are possible rather than certain, never certain, in fact, flowing and interconnected, always inseparable from the context in which they exist, and must be viewed whole, an animate world where things presence to us rather than being represented. In other words, a bureaucrat's nightmare. And its outlook, the right hemisphere's outlook, is essentially realistic. When we look at the world, we don't, unless we stop and reflect, notice that we're alternating different views of the world. Life goes on without our being aware of it, because if we were aware of it, we wouldn't be able to act. But when we do stop and reflect, as we do increasingly in a culture which is a verbal culture, in which we are in discourse with one another, philosophizing about the world, we come to find the world paradoxical. And paradox is a whole issue that I deal with that's central to the new book. There are two aspects to this that concern the hemispheres. The first is that the right hemisphere is able to see that two things that are superficially opposite may in fact both be true. But also at another level, often what turns out to be what we call a paradox is actually a conflict between what the left hemisphere sees and what the right hemisphere sees. And in one of the chapters of the book, I go through perhaps 30 plus examples of paradoxes that are familiar to philosophers and indicate the way in which that is true. So if that's the case, how do we know what we can trust? Well, what I do very, very briefly, and then I'm going to move on because we just don't have time to go into what I have written. I want to talk to you about what is interesting me this evening. What I've looked at is, in order to understand what's trustable, we need to look at the ways, the portals we have on the world, the ways in which we get access to the world at all. And I would say that the most primary of these is attention, which those of you who know my work is a very important concept, because I believe it's creative of reality. It changes what we find in the world and it changes us who attend. But it's also perception, the judgments that we form on the basis of what we perceive or attend to, emotional and social intelligence, good old-fashioned cognitive intelligence, virtually speaking IQ, and our creative potential. And in all these respects, the right hemisphere, from a vast survey of the available neuropsychological literature, I can demonstrate that in all of these respects, the right hemisphere is superior to the left hemisphere. You may say that's a little bit odd, but as I say, there is a reason why in humans, the left hemisphere has become specialized in a kind of disembodied map-making, schema-finding, theorizing about the world, where it is pretty much impervious to reality. And then in the second part of the book, I look at what are the paths. Those are the portals, but what are the paths we follow in seeking an understanding of the world? I think most people would agree that they're probably science, reason, intuition, and imagination. And what I suggest there is that we need all four of these wherever possible. At least we certainly need more than one or two, which is all, I reckon, much of the time anyone brings to bear on these resoundingly important problems. And I also show that in each case, not just in intuition and imagination, but also in the discoveries of science and mathematics and in the application of reason to the world, the right hemisphere is very much superior to the left. It understands what's going on. Actually, that is the point. It understands. Whereas the left hemisphere is good at procedures, very fast following of procedures. But what the procedures mean is another matter altogether. I think probably if you look around you in the modern world, you can see this triumph of procedure over meaning everywhere that you look. And if we can see the signature of the left hemisphere and the signature of the right hemisphere in any particular position on a particular topic, it helps us because we can no longer just go, oh, well, there are these two and they're in conflict. Yeah, shrug the shoulders and go off and have supper. No, we can go further now. We can say one of these is likely to be a better guide than the other. Not invariably, but it is in all probable terms going to be a much profounder guide to an understanding of the world than a vision of it, which we can recognize from its signature, has all the qualities that come from the left hemisphere. Now, this is very important when it comes to dealing with the concept of the sacred and the divine, which is my topic for this evening. Now, it seems to me that to be human, in my view, is to feel a deep gravitational pull towards something ineffable, that if we can just for once get beyond words and reasons, is a matter of experience, and to which we reach out, often wordlessly, though not without misgivings, something that's outside our conceptual grasp, but nonetheless present to us through intimations that come to us from a whole range of unfathomable experiences, which we call spiritual. Now, that's the experiential aspect, but what is the left hemisphere going to do with it? It's going to do three things particularly. It's going to analyze it into parts. It's very good at understanding parts. It doesn't see wholes. So it will start to take it apart and see what it's made of in order to understand it better. It also tends to see things in categories. It wants to know, what pigeonhole can I put this in? So it wants to compare it with something else. And by definition, there is nothing with which this can be in any way compared. And to express it in language. And language is expressed, language we have, the language that we use, is there for us to negotiate pretty much the everyday world. As Nietzsche said, language makes the uncommon common, because the uncommon is always outside of our usual categories to which words refer. And so you have to use language in a very special way that can be done. It's called poetry and it's called myth. Those are the ways in which we transcend that reductionist aspect of language. So what are we to call this profound experience for which we have not the right words, it turns out? Well, the problem is that whatever we call it is going to be potentially misleading. Obviously, in most languages, there is a word for this. So in Sanskrit, it's Rta. In Chinese, it's Li. In Islam, it's Allah. In the Judaic religion, it's Yahweh. We call it God. Whatever this founding principle, this logos, this essence that is the beginning of being, that controls, well, not controls, but gives rise to everything and generates everything that we know in the universe. But as soon as we've got the name there, we think we've understood it. And that's the problem, because the only way we can get to understanding it is paradoxically to hang on to the realization that we have not understood it. As soon as we think we've understood it, we've gone wrong. And so you get the idea of the name of God as the unnameable name, as it is in a number of important religions. And in Taoism, which is very close to my heart, the Tao that can be named is not the real Tao. That is the first opening words of the Tao Te Ching. And in Christianity, the other thing to which my heart is very, very close, St. Augustine says, si comprehendis, non est Deus. If you understand it, then it's not God you've understood. And there is a big misunderstanding about what belief is. Belief, I think one of the great barriers to belief in the modern world is that it has been, after several years of tyrannical analytic philosophy, it has been taken to mean assent to various propositions, which clever men in Oxford and Cambridge, and women in Oxford and Cambridge, can spin logical puzzles with and prove that whatever you think you know, you don't know, which is fine if it would stop there. Unfortunately, philosophers always exempt themselves from this unknowing. But belief is not about signing up to 6 impossible things before breakfast. Belief is not propositional, it's dispositional, as so much in life is. And what is more important than what the right hemisphere and the left hemisphere think is what they are disposed towards, and that governs what they actually find in the world. Their attention is the way in which they dispose consciousness. When you dispose your consciousness in one way, you find one thing. You dispose it in another, you find quite another. And that's something that I go to in great length in both these books. So if you're not familiar with them, that's where to go to find more on that. But just because it's dispositional, it's not baseless or irrational. It's transrational. There are plenty of things that are not irrational, but they're not encompassed by reason. For simplicity and brevity, I'll just take one example: music. Music is profoundly meaningful. It is absolutely not irrational, but it cannot conceivably be put into words, and it cannot conceivably be got to the bottom of by taking it apart, analyzing it into smaller and smaller bits, because all you'll find is single notes, which mean nothing at all. A better idea is of a relationship, because after all, a disposition is in itself suggestive of a relationship. And the archetypal relationship here is love. That's no accident, because in most religions, this is whatever we mean by God, or the ultimate cause of, or the first cause, or the ultimate entity, is love. And love is a disposition, and it's there in the etymology of the word belief. Belief, the leaf part, is present now only in archaic English, as in Shakespeare, my leaf, meaning my beloved. And it's, in fact, for German speakers, it's belief is cognate with belieben. And even Glauben is also from Liebe, Glauben, the German word for to believe. So it's about a disposition of putting your trust in something. And indeed, trust is also very close to truth, and those words also contain the idea of a relationship between things. It's not a thing, but a betweenness. Now, what I mean by a betweenness is not just the space between. So in music, it's not in the gaps between the notes, although sometimes it's been said that it is, in order to distract us from the fact that it's not in the notes itself, but it's in the whole. It's not analyzable in that way. It's in the notes and their relationships with one another. I'll come back to that in a minute. But this is the way that we understand all the most profound experiences, even those of us who are not inclined to believe in anything spiritual, understand that in the case of eros, of erotic love, that it is unencompassable by everyday language, that one expresses it in terms of metaphor, of myth, of narrative, and above all of the implicit. As soon as you make something implicit explicit, you've destroyed its meaning. When you translate a poem into prose, it's lost its power. When you explain a joke, it falls flat. Now, there's nothing shady about this. It doesn't mean that somehow we're in opposition to science. Absolutely not. There is no opposition between science and religion, something I, again, deal with in the book, but won't go into now. But Niels Bohr, of course, one of the great physicists of the 20th century and founders of quantum theory, said that physics can be described only in language that has the nature of poetry. And this doesn't render physics somehow unreal, rather the opposite. He said the fact, speaking of religion, that spiritual traditions through the ages have spoken in images, parables, and paradoxes means simply that there are no other ways of grasping the reality to which they refer. But that doesn't mean that it is not a genuine reality. Now let's think about what a knowledge of God would entail. What would be the disposition that one would have to adopt in order to have a chance of understanding what it is one's approaching? If one approaches it saying, well, I only believe things that are cut and dried, explicit, measurable in the lab, and so on, you're going to miss the point fairly resoundingly. So what does it entail? Well, it requires, first of all, being open to something other, something not already familiar, not part of the self-consistent system which one operates within in ordinary life. And V.S. Ramachandran, great neuroscientist, calls the right hemisphere the devil's advocate, because it's always saying, but this might be something new. This might be something that doesn't fit into our categories. And it's much better at detecting the new, the unthought of, the unexpected. And it mustn't just ignore or simply not see whatever doesn't fit the mind's prevailing paradigm. The right hemisphere is better at that, and it's better at accepting uncertainty and can see that there are limits to knowledge. An understanding of the divine must rely on indirect and metaphorical expression, not direct and literal expression. It must tolerate ambiguity, and it has to be at ease with accepting that both of what on the surface appear to be contradictory elements might be true. In other words, it must be receptive to what we call paradox. Importantly, it must see continuous processes rather than a succession of things or isolated events. A process, in other words, of becoming more than simply a fact of being. It must be able to apprehend that betweenness I talk about, a web of relationships, not just an assemblage of entities. And what is of primary importance in the web is the relationships, not the entities related. Now, for a long time, I have believed that relationships are prior to relata, to the things that are related. And only in the last 3 or 4 years, I discovered that a very important physicist, David Mermin, has said exactly this, that physics shows that relationships are prior to relata. Now, I know that in common sense terms, there can't be relationships between things that haven't yet come into being, but a helpful image might be of a net. And there's a lovely image in Vedanta of Indra's net, which is a net that covers the cosmos. And at every crossing point of the net, there's a little jewel which reflects all the other crossing points in the net. But of course, a net it begins with connections and only becomes a net after there have been lots of connections made, and there are little nodes that we look at, which we call the bits of the net. Another way of thinking about the problem is that actually you can't start with things and then say, so how are they related? Because fundamentally, the way things are related, the context in which they are, tells you what they are. They aren't what they will be when they're in that context of relationship before they're in that context of relationship. So it involves appreciating a cohesive whole, something that comes into being together rather than sequentially and serially. A Gestalt, as the Germans say, a term that's gone into psychological language, not a construction of parts. And entering into an I-thou relationship, not just an I-it relationship. In the Master and His Emissary, I have a chapter on language, which goes into this in some detail. We have an I-thou relationship is what we were talking about, not an I-it, as though we're inspecting it from the outside and trying to understand it by taking it apart or bombarding it with neutrinos in a cloud chamber. Sustaining emotional depth, we must see that spirit and body are not distinct or opposed, but discernibly different aspects of the same being. And in epistemological terms, it requires knowing in the sense of kennen more than wissen. In German, those are the two words for knowing. We are rather unusual in English in not having more than one word for these concepts. To kennen is to know by acquaintance. Wissen is to know, as it were, an abstract piece of knowledge. Paris is the capital of France, whereas you know Paris after you've lived in it for a decade. And in French, there's the same distinction between connaître and savoir. In epistemological terms also, we must value what I would call active receptivity, not just a state of passively being there, but actively listening, attending, and waiting for things to approach you then answer to. And it's this reciprocity, this resonation between the mind, the imagination, the heart, the spirit, whatever one wants to call it. It's not important how one breaks it down, with whatever it is that it exists for that moment, in that experience, as something for the time being other. And it involves sustaining attention and stilling the inner voice, as in prayer and meditation. And these are things that the right hemisphere, all these things are things that the right hemisphere is much better at than the left. In meditation, people often talk about monkey mind, which is the sort of chatter that incessantly goes on in one's mind. we're so used to it that often we're not aware of it until we've learned how to still that chatter, in which we can actually begin to appreciate meditatively, mindfully, the reality that we are experiencing. And a man called Bhante Gunaratana, one of the world's most expert meditators, and has written a book called Mindfulness in Plain English. In the book, I take an account of his, which is 15 lines long, and point out over 20 things that he says, which would suggest that mindfulness depends very much on the right hemisphere more than the left. And there is a range of neuroimaging studies that would bear this out. Now, there are a number of paradoxical things here for us, because I've talked about silence and not speaking, about being comfortable not knowing, about not constantly doing, but actually being there, listening and attending. The power of unknowing and not doing in Chinese philosophy is a very important idea. And those of you who know anything about Buddhism, Zen, Taoism, and so on will recognize what I'm saying. But it's also there in the Western tradition, largely neglected Western tradition of medieval mysticism. And there's a wonderful sermon of Eckhart's in which he describes this unknowing, this darkness that is the fruitful darkness in which one dwells. An image rather reminding me of the title of an anonymous devotional work of mysticism of the same era, The Cloud of Unknowing. And he imagines an interlocutor saying to him, but what is this darkness and unknowing? And what is its name? You see, I want to have a name for this. To this, he replies, I can only call it a loving and open receptiveness, which, however, in no way lacks being. It is a receptive potential by means of which all is accomplished. And this suggests, and it's elaborated elsewhere in his sermons, the idea of the fertility of union between a creative principle and a receptive womb-like space, a female principle, in which something is to grow. So much for thinking about the epistemological things we would need. What about ethically? Well, in ethical terms, the right hemisphere places a huge emphasis on empathy. And the core of almost every religion is this idea of empathy. And I'm afraid to report that the left hemisphere is not good on empathy. David Hecht at UCL says, quite frankly, moral and immoral thinking are associated with the right hemisphere and left hemisphere, respectively. And he's not wrong. There is a remarkable literature on this. What it demonstrates, actually, is that people who have little capacity for empathy tend to rationalize about morality in a very utilitarian way. And that outside of university philosophy faculties, this kind of way of thinking is confined to people with frontal lobe damage, and particularly with right frontal lobe damage. The emphasis is on the consensual rather than the individualistic self, and on vulnerability, a very underrated faculty that is worth spending time cultivating. So it must also recognize and not deny the dark side to human consciousness. A very important thing I can say from my experience as a psychiatrist is helping people to understand the dark side that exists to just about everything, rather than try and deny it, repress it when it comes back larger than life. And of course, Jung's work was very much about accepting and understanding this, being capable of understanding that good may, despite everything, emerge from suffering, which is not that we shouldn't try wherever we can to avoid suffering, but that it is not necessarily a purely, as we say, negative entity. In fact, Viktor Frankl has written wonderfully about that very topic based on his experiences in the Nazi extermination camps. Now, Nothing to me more economically expresses the deep distinction between a view of the cosmos on the one hand as a specifiable assemblage of distinct entities, as the left hemisphere would see it, and on the other as an unnameable, undivided flow, as the right hemisphere would see it, than this insight from the Tao Te Ching, warning us against analysis and the naming of parts. The Tao is forever undefined. Once the whole is divided, the parts need names. There are already enough names. One must know when to stop. Knowing when to stop averts trouble. Tao in the world is like a river flowing home to the sea. Those images are very reminding to me of the poetry of Wordsworth and Wordsworth's Panentheism. Again, I'm talking very much in shorthand tonight because I haven't got time to unpack all these things in any detail, but Panentheism is different from pantheism. Pantheism is the belief that all things just are God and God is all things. Panentheism is to say that God is in all things and all things are in God, but all things and God are not equated. But Panentheism is very much a processual vision of the world in which things come into be within this overarching veil of whatever it is that we cannot name that is above it. And it's that thing that Wordsworth talks about in a wonderful phrase of something evermore about to be. That comes from Tintin Abbey, and he says, he talks about how at times we feel a presence that disturbs me with the joy of elevated thoughts, a sense sublime of something far more deeply interfused, whose dwelling is the light of setting suns and the round ocean and the living air and the blue sky and in the mind of man, a motion and a spirit that impels all thinking things, all objects of all thought, and rolls through all things. It's moving, it's in everything, and it causes everything to carry on being and creating. Now, I know that some people, including Rowan Williams, are not particularly enamored of process theology, and I have to utterly respect that. To me, it seems to contain important wisdom, and I see ideas of it everywhere in the theologies, not just Christian, but of other religions that I've looked to. In the Old Testament, when God appears to Abraham in the burning bush, he says what is translated into English usually as "I am that I am." The Hebrew is ehyeh asher ehyeh, and I am told that that means I will be what I will be. Also, in the story of the creation, there's this wonderful phrase after the every day of creation, except the second day in which he didn't actually create. It says, God looked and saw that it was good. Now, to me, that suggests something absolutely wonderful, which is that whatever it is that is created is not just the dreary following out of a plan that some omnipotent being has thought up, and we are the tools of that plan, but that it is genuinely something that is not yet decided, not entirely fixed. It is creative. It is genuinely coming into being. This is there in the Christian idea that the word was made flesh, because the Greek, again, is it became flesh rather than was made, which makes it sound rather like a procedure that is done to it. And it's important that the phrase begotten, not made is understood, because it's not made, it's not put together, it's not a fact, it's begotten. In other words, in a chain of being of things that reproduce other things, it comes about in that one flow that is the divine creation. It's there in Meister Eckhart. In a number of places he talks about this constant eminence, which emanating presence which comes out of God, which he associates with Christ coming into the human soul. And it's there in Mechtilde of Magdeburg and in a number of other of the medieval mystics. And this becoming is a constant longing and its fulfillment in a something that is evermore coming into being. And that's not just in Wordsworth, but it's in Jacob Boehme, and it's in Buddhism. very much at the core of Buddhism. David Bohm, a very great philosopher and physicist, famously wrote a book about the Implicat Order. And his idea there is that things unfold their potential. This is how I see creation, as the unfolding of that all into its infinite number of possible instantiations. And it unfolds itself continually. So he sees the world as constantly this unfolding of the explicit and the implicate becoming implicate, but he also believed it was then re-enfolded. And oddly enough, this is exactly the idea of Nicholas of Cusa, 15th century polymath, scientist, theologian. He thought that God and his creation was an implicatio, and that this was explicated, unfolded into the many things, the 10,000 things, explicatio, and then further and later, it was re-enfolded in an embrace, the Latin word for which he has is complicatio, of folding together again. That is very much in keeping, interestingly, with the way, I'll tell you first of all about the Kabbalah. I think I've got time. I got to know about the Kabbalah only in the last 7 to 10 years, and it has transformed my life. I have time only now to talk about one myth, which is the in the Lurianic Kabbalah, that of Isaac Luria in the 17th century, building, of course, on and interpreting a very ancient tradition. It's a myth of creation. And in the beginning, it says there was a being, Ein Sof, which means sort of all and nothing. And Ein Sof wanted to create. What was its first act? Was it to stretch out a hand and go, be, come into existence? No, it was to retract, to withdraw. And this phase is known as Tzimtzum. It means God forewent part of himself in order that something else should come into being. Because after all, if this being is loving, it can only love something other than itself. And so it has to make place for something to be genuinely other, genuinely free, not just the pawn of an engineering God, but of a freely creating God. Then there are some vessels that fill the space where God has withdrawn. And a spark of light, a single spark of light and fire falls out of Ein Sof onto these vessels, and it shatters them. It's called Shefarat HaKelim. This means the shattering of the vessels, because they simply aren't big enough to contain what it was. But there is a third phase, Tikkun, which means repair. And in this phase, the pieces of the broken vessels are put together again more beautifully than they were before. So the business of shattering was necessary for their perfection. Incidentally, this raises in my mind the image of a wonderful thing in Japanese art, in which pieces of porcelain that have been broken can be repaired more beautifully than they were before with lines of gold. But in any case, the point is that in this myth, humanity plays a very important part, because little sparks of the divine are in all these pieces. And we as human beings achieve and see these pieces, and it is our role to be putting them together. So we have a positive part to play in creation. What fascinates me about those three phases, the sort of withdrawing to be receptive, the then trying to contain it in categories or vessels, and then that being impossible, but then repairing into something greater, is very much like the way in which I believe the world comes into being for us through the interaction of the hemispheres. So the right hemisphere is open and attentive to whatever comes to it. Then whatever it is sent to the left hemisphere for processing. Left hemisphere says, oh, I see, it goes into that category, it goes into that category, goes into that pigeonhole. But this simply can't happen with something as great as this. And so, as it were, the categories are ruined. But the attempt was not a waste of time. This business of trying, as long as it's then handed over again to the right hemisphere to bring this back together into an overarching whole, make something better. Think of a piece of music that you love and you want to play. You're initially attracted to it. Then as you find you can't play it well, you break it up into bits and you practice the parts and you see the harmonic structure. But then when you come to play it again, if you give a performance, you must forget all of that. But it's not that that time was wasted. Without that time, you wouldn't be able to give the final performance. Now, what does the left hemisphere make of this essence of the divine? Well, of course, it wants it all to be cut and dried, and it wants it to be certain. It wants it to be in language, preferably written language, and it wants it to be structured. So you get theological disputation, you get the genesis of organizations, hierarchies, laws and structures of all kinds. And when they are valuable, they're most valuable as being the means for teaching, healing in schools, hospitals, and so forth. But they can also give rise to all the things that power structure can give rise to. What it wants is left hemisphere analysis and argument. And in this sense, there is an extraordinary coming together of militant fundamentalism with militant atheism. They are mirror images of one another. And the great divide, in my view, is not between believers and those who say they're not, who mostly say they're agnostic rather than atheistic. But your militant atheist and your militant believer are each of them, in my view, expressing simply the left hemisphere's incapacity to deal with something unless it's all written down, it's certain, I'm right, you're wrong, and we've got the truth at last. Interestingly, by the way, Dan Dennett says that if he'd not become a philosopher, he would have become an engineer. I'm afraid these people also see God as an engineering God, which is something that I find very distasteful. And what they really love, and I'm afraid you see this not just in religious groups, but as I say, in atheistic groups, and now very much in the cultural wars, the necessity for black and white categories, the necessity for this is right, and you shall not say anything against it. No other opinions than this are even tolerable. If you even touch on them, your career will be finished. They express not kindness, but a narcissistic self-righteousness. And it's accompanied, as these reformations always were, by the destruction of images, paintings, and the beauty of real art, and the banishment of humor. You find this in the 17th century Puritans. You find this in descriptions of the desecration of churches in Holland in the same era. And we're seeing it again in our lifetime. One of the reasons for having religion is constantly to remind us of a broader context, of another order that is a moral order, not just a rational one, a network of obligations to other humans, to the earth, and to the other that lies beyond, extending beyond our lives, that is in space and time, yet rooted firmly in places, spaces, practices, here and now. Without it, this sense risks being dissipated. Trust depends on shared beliefs. Religion is the manifestation of that trust and the embedding of it into the fabric of daily life. Religion embodies awareness of God in the world through deeply resonant myths, narratives, and symbols, enacted in rituals, conducted in holy places that parallel the cyclical passage of time. I'm not sure the world can afford to lose this stream of wisdom. For this, of course, both hemispheres are important. Let me make that clear. But the left hemisphere must always serve the right hemisphere, which understands. It is the emissary of the master. I got to know also recently, or in the last 5 years, the work of Abraham Heschel, I think, New York rabbi of the last century. And there's a wonderful passage, there are many, but one he describes in the rabbinic tradition, the two kinds of teaching that are distinguished. One is literal and legalistic, the other metaphorical and imaginative. The first is called halakha, and the other is called agada. But Halakha must serve Agada. And he shows how in the traditions of Judaism, you can see both elements and that they can harmonize as long as Halakha remains subservient to Agada. But he said that in his own life, Halakha had begun to usurp Agada. Now, as I say, I can find these images of usurpation, a kind of inward self-cognition of the mind about the nature of our thinking and knowing and understanding in many cultures, pretty much any culture in which you look for it across the world. It's a very deep and ancient story that we recognize. But I can begin to put some neurology with that. And we're seeing it also in modern science, the best modern science, which is much less dogmatic and much more aware of the way in which our consciousness and whatever it is outside of that personal consciousness interrelate. It's there, this consciousness, the story of the usurpation. It's there in Rumi, and it's there in the Mahabharata. And as I say, it's there in Chinese wisdom literature. And in our own culture, it is the story that is told in Paradise Lost. Thank you very much.